Some people say these battleships look ugly. Well, if by ugly you mean unconventional, then absolutely. They're not elegant, they don't have sweeping lines or sleek silhouettes. They're blunt, brutalist behemoths. They scream function over form, firepower by any means necessary. But to me, that has a charm all of its own. Conventional good looks don't matter that much when you're pounding the Bismarck into molten scrap metal, or flipping Tiger tanks upside down like Tonka toys. Plus, who needs to shoot backwards anyway? The Nelson class, HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney were the most heavily armed British battleships ever built, mounting 9 16-inch guns. But all 9 of those guns were mounted forward of the bridge. Yeah, the Nelsons look weird, and when they entered service in 1927, they looked even weirder. People were used to the classic battleship layout. A couple turrets forward, a couple aft, maybe 1 or 2 stuck somewhere between the funnels for good measure. Some designs got carried away, HMS Agincourt springs to mind. And earlier dreadnoughts even had wing turrets, which thankfully died a quick death because firing arcs matter. The point is, the Nelsons didn't follow that pattern. Instead, you had A turret at the bow. Behind that, raised on a platform, was B turret, what's known as a super firing turret. Standard stuff so far. But then came the weird bit. The confusingly named X turret, although it was sometimes called C turret, tucked awkwardly behind B, still facing forwards. It couldn't fire directly aft, it was blocked by the ship's massive superstructure. It could barely fire forward either, unless the ship was angled just right. Really, it was designed for broadsides, and that's about it. It looks kind of wrong, but it worked. You know, when people talk about battleships of the 20th century, they often think in terms of categories and archetypes. Like if someone just says battleship, the image in my mind is probably something like the Queen Elizabeth class. You say fast battleship, many people would think of the Iowa class. But you say treaty battleship, it's the Nelson class every time. The quintessential textbook treaty battleship. A 34,000-ton compromise. You know the saying, a camel is a horse designed by a committee? Well, the Nelson class is a battleship designed to a treaty. The 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, to be exact, which capped battleships at 35,000-ton standard displacement. The Washington Naval Treaty is actually where the term standard displacement comes from. Basically due to the British lobbying for a new definition of displacement that didn't include fuel and boiler feed water, on the grounds that British ships needed to carry more of both to operate across a global empire. Compared to, say, Italy, who only really cared about the Mediterranean, or the US or Japan, whose fleets mostly stayed closer to home bases. The definition of standard displacement also allowed the Nelsons to cheat a bit by having water-filled torpedo bulges that were effectively a form of armor, but whose weight was discounted from the standard displacement because it was water. You know, maybe I'm biased, but I don't think you can blame the British for being a bit cheeky. They were at least trying to comply with the treaty. A lot of the time, navies just straight up lied about how much their ships weighed. And so the Nelson-class battleships were born. The first and most distinctive ships built explicitly to comply with treaty limits. Nelson and Rodney, aka the Nelrods, sometimes known as the Cherry Tree class because they'd been cut down by Washington. For anyone who doesn't know, there's a probably made-up anecdote about George Washington chopping down a cherry tree when he was a little kid. But when his father asks him if he did it, he can't help but tell the truth and so doesn't get in trouble for some reason. Anyway, the Nelsons were the only new battleships the Royal Navy was going to get between the wars. So they needed to provide maximum capability within that 35,000-ton limit. The Brits went big, developing a new 16-inch gun, the maximum caliber allowed by the treaty, to match the American Colorado class and Japan's Nagato class. But when it came to actually placing the weapons on the ship, British naval architects had a realization. They could save weight by putting all the main guns at the front. You see, Nelson and Rodney were the first British battleships to implement what's known as an all-or-nothing armor layout. The idea was that instead of trying to armor the entire ship, which wastes weight on protecting less critical areas, you only armor the ship's most vital systems. Magazines, engines, boiler rooms. Everything else, the bow, the stern, upper decks, is left mostly unarmored or only lightly protected. The result is a heavily armored citadel, basically a big armored box in the middle of the ship. Placing all the main guns forward also meant that their magazines could be grouped together, shortening the length of that armored citadel. And while the Nelson's armored citadel was compact, it was also substantial, with an internal armored belt, which meant it was behind the outer hull plating, that was angled at 18 degrees and 14 inches thick, together with deck armor measuring up to 6¼ inches, and the aforementioned torpedo bulges. This was very solid protection for the time, and all possible in a ship coming in at just under 34,000 tons standard displacement. replacement. Now, much of this design was borrowed from the cancelled G3 and N3 capital ship plans. The N3 actually had a similar turret setup, and that design wasn't constrained by any treaty. So this wasn't just a compromise solution, it was also just a way to maximize armor while minimizing weight. The guns themselves were a brand new design, the BL 16-inch Mark I naval gun, a step up from the 15-inch guns on the preceding Queen Elizabeth and R classes. And this gun marked something of a departure from British gunnery tradition. The Royal Navy had long been a fan of relatively low-velocity, heavy projectiles, because a big, heavy shell retains much of its penetration power when lobbed over long distances. But near the end of World War I, British analysts feared these shells were failing to penetrate armor properly, often shattering on impact. So they looked to the Germans, who favored lighter, higher velocity projectiles, which at shorter ranges were still very capable of punching through thick armor. And this is partly why the Germans clung on to their 11 and 12-inch guns while the British were upgrading to 13.5s and 15s. The British were impressed by captured German weapons in testing which later turned out to be partly flawed. But regardless, the takeaway was that the next British gun should fire a high-velocity, lighter shell. Lighter, that is, relative to its caliber. They were going up to 16-inch after all. So it would still be heavier than the 15-inch, but not much heavier. Just over 2,000 pounds compared to the 1,900-pound 15-inch shell. Initially, the new gun had a muzzle velocity of 823 meters per second. Unfortunately, more than fast enough to chew through the gun's rifling, wearing out the barrels after just 180 rounds, which was deemed unacceptable. So muzzle velocity was reduced to 788 meters per second, extending barrel life to around 250 rounds. But this meant that, in the end, the Nelson class was left with the worst of both worlds. A not especially high-velocity gun firing a relatively lightweight shell. So they had a significantly lighter broadside than, say, American ships also armed with 9 16-inch guns. Though in fairness, those ships were from a full generation later. Still, the Nelsons outgunned any European battleship they were expected to fight. Like, oh, I don't know, the Bismarck. Yeah, once the kinks were worked out, the British 16-inch was a perfectly adequate gun. And there were 9 of them, which helped. Because not only are the Nelsons the only 16-inch armed British battleships, they're also the only British battleships with triple turrets. The secondary battery was 12 6-inch guns in 6 twin turrets grouped at the rear. As built, the Nelsons also featured 6 4.7-inch AA guns and 8 40mm pom-poms. This anti-aircraft battery was heavily beefed up over the ship's careers, with 50 cal machine guns, 20mm Ehrlichens, and 40mm Bofors. Those cages are to stop the AA gunners blasting each other, by the way. And torpedoes, 2 24.5-inch torpedo tubes. Putting torpedoes on battleships being something of a British obsession, though the Nelsons were the last ones with torpedo launchers. Did they have any success with them? Well, we'll get to that. The ships were also notable for their chunky octopoidal control towers, nicknamed with typical British sarcasm the Queen Anne's Mansion, because of its resemblance to the 14-storey residential development opposite St James's Park tube station in London. Like so much on the ship, it may not have been pretty, but it was practical. The crews liked it. It was a roomy, weatherproof space from which to command and navigate the ship. This style of superstructure would become a hallmark of British battleships going forward, and would even be retrofitted to older ships like Warspite. Another quirk, one that's easier to miss than the weird turret layout or the floating block of flats, just 2 propeller shafts instead of 4 like every other British battleship since HMS Dreadnought. The engine rooms were also pushed closer to the propellers, further reducing the length of the citadel. Another neat little weight-saving trick. This setup generated a maximum speed rated at 23 knots. Maybe a bit more at a push. Rodney reached 23.8 knots during sea trials. Possibly even faster if, say, she really wanted to catch a German battleship and didn't mind ruthlessly bullying her own engines to near breaking points. In any case, 23 knots was respectable in 1927. In 1940, though, with 30-knot German capital ships zooming around the North Atlantic, not so much. The huge bridge tower set way back on the hull didn't help either. It made the Nelsons sluggish in high wind and a bit tricky to handle, but on real operations this wasn't a major issue. Yeah, the Nelsons were just too slow to be considered first-rate battleships in the Second World War. But that didn't stop them putting in serious work. Both ships escorted vital convoys and hunted German raiders in the North Atlantic, including one German raider you might have heard of, the Bismarck. HMS Rodney was instrumental in its destruction in May 1941. Once Bismarck had been crippled by air attacks, Rodney was able to catch up and get stuck in. She pounded the German battleship with a terrifying volume of fire. 340 16-inch shells. Lightweight projectiles projectile or not, 340 of them is going to ruin your day. Something like 100 of these shots were fired at a range of less than 3 kilometers. For a gun with a maximum range of 36 kilometers, that's basically point blank. Rodney's salvo smashed Bismarck's bridge, wrecked most of her heavy armaments, and generally turned her into a floating pile of mangled scrap metal. She may not have been the ship that sank the German battleship, but Rodney was the one who broke Bismarck. She was actually damaged more by her own guns than Bismarck's. Yeah, this was another known issue with the gunnery setup. The blast would buckle deck plating, loosen rivets and bolts, crack windows, light bulbs, water pipes, and urinals. There were fears that full broadsides could even cause serious structural damage. But after firing like 40 broadsides at Bismarck, turns out it was just violently traumatic for the ship's fittings and plumbing. Yeah, don't be on the toilet when one of these goes off. Rodney even managed to launch 3 torpedoes at Bismarck, one of which may have hit, but this has yet to be confirmed. If true, it would be the only instance of a battleship torpedoing another battleship. Vindication for the Royal Navy's obsession with putting torpedoes on battleships? Probably not. Both Nelson and Rodney rained down fire on Axis positions during the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. There are reports of 16-inch shells landing so close to German tanks that 50-ton Tigers were flipped upside down. Because a near miss from a 16-inch shell, well, it's not really a miss, is it? By the end of World War II, both ships had been worked hard. Neither had seen major modernizations, and now the Nelsons were simply showing their age. Rodney especially was worn out. She was scrapped in 1948. Nelson was in better shape, and according to Churchill, there was talk of modernizing her to serve in the post-war fleet, but ultimately she was just too slow for the new era of fast carrier operations. So in 1949, Nelson too was sent to the breakers. Now you might be wondering, if the Nelson's all guns forward layout was such a clever weight-saving trick, why didn't the next British battleships, the King George V class, use it too? Well, the short answer is, the Nelsons were a bit of a rush job. They were designed under tight treaty constraints and with limited time. An emergency workaround that worked but wasn't ideal. By the time KG-5 came around, British designers had the luxury of hindsight. And the conclusion was that the Nelson's layout, while not a failure, was, let's say, quirky. Clever, but suboptimal. So they went back to the more conventional 2 in front, 1 in back setup. And while we're on the KG-5s, why did they mount 14-inch guns? That sounds like a downgrade from 16-inch, right? Blame the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936, which limited new battleships to 14-inch main guns. There was a clause to allow bigger guns if certain conditions were met, and those conditions were met, but by that point, the KG-5 design was already locked in. Reworking it to accommodate new, heavier guns would have delayed construction by years. And frankly, the Nelson's existing 16-inch had been a bit of a disappointment. So the Royal Navy went with what they had, 10 14-inch guns, in a slightly weird-looking 2-quad, 1 twin turret layout that actually has a similar utilitarian vibe to the Nelson's. It works, it's good enough, who cares what it looks like? Okay, so what about the successor to the Nelson's successor, HMS Vanguard, the last British battleship ever built? She didn't get 14 or 16-inch guns, she got the old World War I vintage 15-inch. Because, put simply, those were the guns they had in stock, specifically the spare turrets from the old Courageous class battlecruisers, which had been turned into aircraft carriers back in the day. It was a classic case of, we've got these perfectly good guns, might as well use them, slap them on a hull, tweak the design, boom, new battleship. The real successor to the King George V class was supposed to be the Lion class, armed with a new and improved 16-inch gun firing proper heavyweight shells. But of course, that never happened, because by then, the age of the battleship was already ticking down. But alright, let's address the big battleship grey elephant in the room. What happened when a Nelson class needed to shoot something behind it? Well, seems like it just wasn't much of an issue. I'm not aware of any situation where Nelson or Rodney desperately needed to fire astern and couldn't, because the actual blind spot directly behind the ship was only about 30 degrees, a narrow slice of sea. And ships turn. A few seconds on the helm and you've got your firing arc back. Plus, it's not as if they were defenseless from the rear. Most of the 6-inch secondaries could cover the aft quarters just fine. And yeah, you couldn't fire all the main guns directly forward either. But guess what? That's true of every traditional battleship design too. Turrets in the rear aren't doing much when you're charging ahead. The Nelsons, on the other hand, could fire 6 16-inch guns straight forwards and still deliver a full 9-gun broadside just by tweaking their heading by a few degrees. But hang on, you might ask, why not raise that third turret higher so it could fire over the others? You know, make it super duper firing or hyper mega firing. Well, there's this thing called physics. You lift a massive triple 16-inch turret even higher on the superstructure, you raise the ship's center of gravity. Do that too much and the whole thing becomes dangerously top-heavy and unstable, which is generally frowned upon at sea. But really, all this talk of fore and aft is kind of beside the point, because battleships were built to fire broadsides, and that's where they shine. The dominant method of naval gunnery for centuries, because it lets you bring the maximum number of guns to bear on a target. Which brings us to the classic maneuver of big gun combat, crossing the T. You want your battle line to form the top of the letter T, with the enemy coming head-on forming the stem. That way you can unload with every gun along the line, while the enemy can only reply with the forward guns of their lead ships. I mean, don't get me wrong, rear-facing turrets are obviously a nice to have. In the chaos of battle, you can't always line up that perfect broadside. The enemy can appear from anywhere, damage might prevent you from maneuvering, and sometimes you've just got to make do with the angles you've got. But even so, for the Nelson class, the lack of rear guns wasn't a deal breaker. And really, what better way to honor the class's namesake? What could be more Nelsonian than a ship designed to just go straight at them? And while we're talking namesakes, Rodney deserves his moment too. Admiral George Rodney, 1st Baron Rodney, who beat the Spanish at Cape St. Vincent in 1780 and the French at the Battle of the Somme in 1782, where he's sometimes credited with inventing the breaking the line tactic. You know, that thing Nelson would go on to make famous at Trafalgar? Essentially allowing your T to be crossed, gambling that the enemy won't capitalize on the opportunity, then crossing their T multiple times and just hammering them. Talking of the French, similarly limited by naval treaties and at least partially inspired by the Nelson class, the French Dunkirk and Richelieu classes also had their entire main batteries placed forwards, albeit in 2 super-firing quad turrets, not 3 triples, and these were generally well-regarded vessels. Although in the case of Dunkirk and her sister Strasbourg, there may be an instance where the all-forward main battery actually prevented the ships from firing. During the British attack on Mers el-Kebir in July 1940, the attempt to seize or neutralize the French fleet to prevent it falling into German hands, both Dunkirk and Strasbourg were moored with their bows facing inland, so they couldn't return fire on the British ships out at sea, at least not until they got underway. But alright, let's talk aesthetics. There's no denying the Nelsons were divisive in the looks department. I mean, they were nicknamed Nelsol and Rodnol, a nod to a class of World War I era fleet oilers, all with names starting with Ol. And yeah, they do look like oil tankers with guns. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But you know what? Oil tankers have a certain stark industrial charm. And it's the same with the Nelsons. Built for a job, not a beauty contest. You know, people love to rave about ships with beautiful lines. Like HMS Hood, sure, graceful profile. But let's be honest, once you've seen one big gun capital ship, you've kind of seen them all. At least you've got a general idea what they all look like. And I'll be real with you, I'm not always the best at telling them apart. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have a photo my great-grandfather took of the battlecruiser HMS Tiger, and I couldn't even identify her by sight. I had to ask the internet. But I already knew the name HMS Tiger. You know, I knew it was a cool ship, its appearance just wasn't stuck in my mind. To me, that's what makes the Nelsons special. You can't mistake them for anything else. They're different, they're memorable, they've got so much character. And personally, I think they look great. They're an embodiment of early 20th century industrial design. Brutalist before brutalism was even a thing. In some ways, they're the most imposing battleships ever built. 9 16-inch guns all stacked up together like fists pointing to the horizon. Just an awe-inspiring wall of firepower. The closest thing to an Imperial Star Destroyer to ever sail the ocean. They may not have been a resounding success, but they were far from a failure. A compromised design that was innovative, if not massively influential. They were nevertheless invaluable assets in World War II. The newest, most powerful British battleships in 1939. The new KG-5s were coming, but only at a rate of 1 or 2 per year. If it had come to a German amphibious invasion in 1940, Nelson and Rodney would have been the spearheads, or more accurately, the steel battering ram of the home fleet as it steamed down into the English Channel, on its potentially one-way trip to annihilate the invasion fleet at any cost. And yes, that was the plan. These were ships that, all things considered, had no business being as successful as they were. Were they perfect? No. Were they pretty? Depends on your taste. Were they effective? Absolutely. And I just think they're neat. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. This was a longer one. I've been wanting to take a detailed look at the Nelson class for a while, well because, cards on the table, HMS Rodney is probably my favourite battleship. Partly for how the Nelson class looks, partly for her wartime record, and partly because it just reminds me of Nicholas Lyndhurst. Again, thank you for watching. This is a fairly niche topic. Where the turrets go on a battleship is not something that day-to-day most people concern themselves with. I am not one of those people. Battleship turret placement is my Roman Empire. I mean, the Roman Empire is also my Roman Empire. Maybe trireme ore placement would be a good follow-up. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know what you think in the comments and look forward to new videos. I will see you again very soon.